Trump lost to the Vatican. The Holy See has taken a death grip. The White House is shaking. Pope Leo finished off the US president's ratings. Trump is losing everything. Republicans are in shock. An unexpected turn. Trump's policy weakened Russia. The US president did everything against Ukraine, but it played into its hands. The results of Ukraine's actions are shocking. Putin's capitulation is on the horizon. I'll tell you all the details in a moment. Greetings, this is Ukraine Today. I'm Victoria Perepelitsa, and the latest events. Don't threaten the Chicago Pope. Trump got involved in a war that he seems to be already losing. While the master of the White House tried to pressure the Vatican, his own ratings began to plummet rapidly. Even those Americans who were previously ready to turn a blind eye to any scandals are now turning away from the president en masse.
According to Fox polls, 61% of voters disapprove of his performance. Trump has negative indicators on the issues of the war with Iran, the economy, and immigration.
And it is at this very moment that a figure enters the political arena that Trump's headquarters clearly underestimated. A Chicago native, the first American Pope, Leo XIV, unexpectedly turns into one of the most inconvenient opponents of the US president.
As the midterm elections approach, the determined opposition of the first American Pope toward Trump is increasingly perceived as one of the factors contributing to Trump's transformation into a powerless president losing influence.
And now for the most interesting part. The Hill highlights several alarming signals for the White House at once. First, the drop in Trump's popularity is recognized even by traditionally Republican loyal sources. Second, the Pope not only refused to submit to political pressure, but also effectively went on a public offensive right before the midterm elections. The main message sounds extremely tough.
Trump does not conform to the basic principles of Christian teaching. I am not afraid of the Trump administration, and I am not afraid to speak loudly about the message of the gospel, because I believe that is exactly why I am here.
And finally, the third conclusion. Trump's team surely already dreams of forgetting this loud conflict that the president himself unleashed. But there is no turning back now. Let me remind you, it was Trump who first caused a loud scandal around the new pope. He called Leo the 14th week on crime and terrible on foreign policy. Of course, no apologies followed. Moreover, the White House only intensified the attack, accusing the pontiff of a dangerous position on the Iranian nuclear program as well.
The Pope would prefer to talk about how it's normal for Iran to have nuclear weapons. Honestly, I really don't think that's actually very good at all.
Furthermore, Trump stated that the Pope's words allegedly put Catholics and many other people at risk. However, the Vatican didn't even think about giving up its positions.
The Pope goes his own way, that is, he preaches the gospel. Peace, as St. Paul would say, in every opportunity, both in season and out of season.
To smooth things over, the White House is sending Marco Rubio, a Catholic and Secretary of State, on a holy pilgrimage. He's being thrown into the Vatican like a firefighter into a burning house. The official goal of Rubio's visit is to thaw relations between the White House and the Vatican, but in fact it was an emergency mission after Trump's failure. While Donald Trump is losing support in the polls, the Pope has become the most popular leader among Americans. 57% of respondents view him favorably.
According to an Economist YouGov poll, the Pope's net favorability rating is +32, while Trump's is -22. Most Catholics, regardless of their level of religiosity or demographic group, have a positive view of Pope Leo XIV.
There is an important clarification. The Hill relies on a 2025 study even before the open conflict between Trump and the Pope. That was worth noting. However, the main conclusion remains the same. The US president deliberately entered into a conflict with a man whose level of trust among Americans turned out to be significantly higher than his own. And this is despite the fact that about 60 million US residents call themselves Catholics.
According to a poll that was conducted in June by the Pew Research Center, significantly more Catholics believe that Trump was far too critical of Leo XIV. 51% than those who believe he was not critical enough, which was only 4%.
The scandal, which began because of Trump's desire to put on a loud political show, will now cost the entire Republican Party dearly this fall. And for Ukraine, such a situation, on the contrary, could open a window of opportunity and bring closer the return of full American support. Meanwhile, The Telegraph publishes an even more unexpected assessment. The publication claims that Donald Trump had no intention of helping Ukraine defeat Russia, but it was his actions that could have unexpectedly brought such a result closer.
During the presidential campaign, Donald Trump promised over and over again that he would end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Of course, he didn't do that. More than 1,580 days of this war have already passed, and it is still raging. But here's the irony. Trump's own actions, none of which were aimed at helping Ukraine, may have brought the end of this war closer than anything before.
During Joe Biden's time, Ukraine received large-scale military aid, but along with it came strict restrictions. Kyiv was constantly urged to avoid any steps that could lead to escalation. In fact, this seriously limited the capabilities of the Ukrainian army. After Trump's arrival, the situation changed dramatically. Washington first cut support for Ukraine, and then the whole world saw a loud conflict between Trump and Zelensky in the Oval Office, where the American president publicly stated that Ukraine has no trump cards.
It was a demoralizing moment for Ukraine and for everyone who wants Russia to lose. But it opened up new opportunities.
However, it was precisely after this event that processes began to unfold that the Kremlin clearly did not expect. When the United States stopped funding Ukraine, they simultaneously lost the ability to dictate the terms of the war to Kyiv. The Ukrainian army gained much more freedom of action and began striking Russia's military and oil infrastructure using drones and missiles. The result turned out to be painful for Moscow. The country that considered itself an energy superpower is drowning in lines for gasoline that isn't there and won't be.
Ukraine is also striking factories supplying weapons and intended for military purposes, as well as cutting off supply lines to occupied Crimea in ways we couldn't have imagined a year ago.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin has once again smelled a coup. While Putin tries to convince Russians that the situation is under full control, voices of discontent are increasingly heard within Russia itself. And if before all threats to the Kremlin came from the outside, now the most alarming signals are coming from within. Moscow still shudders at the memories of Prigozhin's march, and new statements and moods are forcing more and more uncomfortable questions. And most importantly, isn't Putin today afraid of his own henchmen much more than external enemies? Let's watch. What the Kremlin feared after Prigozhin is surfacing once again. A Russian occupier recorded an appeal to Putin and threatened a scenario that Moscow would prefer to erase from its memory forever. The army will turn its weapons against the Kremlin. According to the occupier, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers are allegedly held in so-called zindans, pits, and improvised prisons, where they are thrown for refusing to follow suicidal orders or for conflicts with command. He claims that the military are punished, beaten, forced to give money, and the most inconvenient ones are simply zeroed out. And here an especially uncomfortable question for the Kremlin arises. If all this is just the fabrications of one person, then why was the appeal watched by millions of Russians in just a few days? And if at least part of what was said is true, then we are already talking about a much more serious problem, the accumulation of discontent within the army itself. Something else is also telling. Until very recently, Russian propaganda convinced society that the army and the government represented a single monolith. But the longer the war continues, the more often stories of conflicts between soldiers in command, of punishments, corruption, and mutual distrust break out. Although it's still too early to talk about any real mutiny, the very appearance of such statements looks very symptomatic. After all, the biggest problems for any government begin not when it's criticized by opponents. The most dangerous moment comes when uncomfortable questions start being asked by their own, those who just yesterday were called the main pillar of the state. It seems that the ghost of June 2023 still haunts the Kremlin offices. And every time words about weapons pointed toward Moscow are heard from the Russian military environment, the Kremlin involuntarily remembers how quickly confidence in full control can turn into a panicked search for answers. And here it's worth recalling the words of Volodymyr Zelensky. The Ukrainian president recently stated directly that Vladimir Putin fears more than just defeat in the war. Most of all, he fears his own army. According to Zelensky, that's exactly why the Kremlin clings so desperately to continuing the war. Because the return of hundreds of thousands of soldiers home without a victory could create problems for the Russian authorities that they fear far more than sanctions or international isolation. And if you look at recent events, these words no longer seem like a simple political declaration. First, there was Prigozhin's march on Moscow, which showed how unexpectedly the usual control schemes can fall apart. Now, new appeals from the military are appearing, openly speaking of discontent within the army and even mentioning the possibility of turning their weapons toward the Kremlin. And here, a particularly unpleasant dilemma arises for the Russian authorities. The longer the war continues, the more people pass through the front, gaining their own experience and stop looking at reality through the television. And along with this, the number of those who start asking uncomfortable questions to the command and the country's leadership is growing. Zelensky is convinced that Putin understands this threat perfectly. That's why, according to him, the Russian president fears ending the war without a declared victory. because then he'll have to explain to society why huge losses were incurred and to hundreds of thousands of servicemen why all the sacrifices didn't bring the promised result. And while Russian propaganda continues to talk about full control over the situation, more and more signals indicate the opposite. The most dangerous challenges for the Kremlin may come not from abroad, but from within the system itself, from people who for years were called the main pillar of the Russian state. And while the Russian military openly threatens the Kremlin, other supporters of the war are starting to sound the alarm over a completely different problem. It seems more and more people inside Russia itself are starting to worry not about victory at the front, but about what's happening in stores, at gas stations, and in their own wallets. Particularly telling was the appeal of the well-known Z blogger Evgeny Golman, a man who can hardly be suspected of sympathizing with Ukraine or criticizing the war. But this time, even he didn't hold back his emotions. In the country, tell the president, tell the minister of defense. In his video, the propagandist effectively called on Russians to prepare for hard times. He advised buying up long-term storage products, stocking up on salt, canned goods, and even mentioned fuel problems in the regions. It sounded as if it wasn't a war supporter speaking to the citizens, but a man preparing for serious economic turbulence. Until recently, it was these very bloggers who convinced Russians that the economy had withstood the sanctions, industry was working at full capacity, and the country was successfully overcoming all difficulties. Now the same people are suddenly advising to set aside buckwheat, matches, and canned meat. And this looks like a very alarming symptom. Moreover, in his emotional speech, Golman effectively accused the Russian elite of living in a separate reality, saying that while ordinary people are advised to endure and donate money for the war, officials still feel quite comfortable and have no intention of giving up their usual lifestyle. The Kremlin's biggest problem right now isn't Ukrainian drones or even sanctions. Rats.
Office rats like you.
The biggest problem is that more and more supporters of the system itself are starting to ask questions to which the authorities have no simple answers. And when even the most ardent supporters of the war advise stocking up on buckwheat and preparing for a difficult autumn, it already looks like a signal far more serious than any official reports on stability. Urgent. The first days of the 40-day campaign announced by Zelensky bring explosions, transport problems, infrastructure accidents, and new surprises for the Russian war machine. So a rather uncomfortable question arises for the Kremlin. What will happen on the 10th day, the 20th, and the 40th? Because while Putin talks about stability, the shockwave is already rolling from the occupied territories to the very heart of the Russian defense industry, and the first signals of this countdown for Moscow have turned out to be more than painful. Details in our report. 40 days for the Kremlin. While Russian propaganda continues to talk about stability and full control over the situation, Moscow seems to be facing very turbulent times. Kyiv has approved a plan that could seriously spoil the mood of many inhabitants of the Kremlin offices. Volodymyr Zelensky announced the launch of a special 40-day operation to influence Russia, the main goal of which is to make the aggressor think about ending the war. The most interesting thing is that we are not talking about loud statements or diplomatic ultimatums. It's about what Russia has still been feeling in recent months: strikes on military facilities, warehouses, logistics hubs, airfields, and enterprises working for the Russian war machine, and it seems that now they have decided to intensify this work even more. Particular attention is drawn to the fact that the basis of the new campaign is precisely the capabilities of the security service of Ukraine. According to Zelensky, SBU units have been demonstrating some of the best results for several months in a row thanks to the use of various types of drones. And the Alpha Special Operations Center is even called one of the leaders in the amount of destroyed Russian equipment and manpower. And if before the Russian leadership could convince the population that the war was somewhere far away, now more and more Russian regions regularly make the news because of explosions, drone attacks, fires at strategic facilities, and transport collapses at airports. It seems that Kyiv is increasingly shifting the focus from fighting for individual kilometers of the front to creating problems for the entire Russian military system. And if before Moscow talked about the exhaustion of Ukraine, now it increasingly has to explain to its own citizens why another airfield, factory, or warehouse has once again found itself at the center of an emergency. The number itself looks especially symbolic: 40 days. In the Kremlin, they have probably already gotten used to counting missiles, drones, and sanctions, but now it seems they will also have to count the days. Days during which the Ukrainian special services intend to remind the Russian authorities of a simple thing: the longer the war continues, the more expensive it costs Russia itself. And if the last few months have already forced Moscow to pull air defense systems to the capital, transfer resources to protect residences, and save the most important facilities, the main intrigue now lies elsewhere. How painful the next 40 days will be for the Kremlin, and whether this campaign will become another weighty argument in favor of the fact that continuing the war is costing Russia more and more. And while the SBU launches a new large-scale pressure campaign on Russia, the situation for the occupiers on the front is also getting worse, especially where the Kremlin recently felt almost completely safe, in Crimea. The peninsula, which Russian propaganda has for years called an unsinkable aircraft carrier, increasingly resembles a territory of total logistical catastrophe. The biggest hysteria in recent days was caused by the Russian ZWAR correspondents themselves. The reason is quite telling. Ukrainian drones have begun systematically hunting not only warehouses, radars, and air defense systems, but also the so-called mobile fire groups of the occupiers. The very units that were supposed to protect Russian columns and cover Crimea from air attacks. And here it turned into an almost classic Russian story. The command decided to save its cargo by placing armed escorts nearby. But it turned out the opposite. If before Ukrainian operators had to search for a valuable target, now the Russians themselves have begun to mark it. If you see a column with a mobile fire group, it means there's something important inside. Then the drones come into play. The scale of the problem can no longer be hidden even by Russian propaganda. If at the beginning of the year the occupiers lost about 4,000 units of motor transport per month, now the count is already in the tens of thousands. In just the partial month of June, losses exceeded 10,000 units of equipment, and on certain days, new records are set. But the real nightmare for the occupiers begins off the Crimean coast. The Russians have placed mobile fire groups along the coastline to shoot down Ukrainian drones. It would seem a logical solution, if not for one problem. Ukrainian sea drones are now hunting these groups themselves. As a result, the hunters are increasingly turning into prey. In fact, Crimea is caught between two fires. From land, Ukrainian drones continue to methodically destroy the occupiers' logistics. From the sea, naval platforms and FPV drones are operating, and the Russian mobile groups that were supposed to be protection are increasingly becoming another line in the loss statistics. The most unpleasant thing for the Kremlin is that all this no longer looks like isolated episodes. It increasingly resembles a systematic campaign. First, Ukrainian forces began knocking out radars and air defense systems, then they took on logistics. Now it's the turn of the lowest level of Russian air defense, and each new step makes life harder for the entire group of occupiers on the peninsula. Meanwhile, multi-kilometer traffic jams are being recorded near the Kerch Bridge. According to satellite data, about 1,500 cars could have accumulated in the queue, and the column itself stretched for about 10 kilometers. In Russian social media, this is already being called an absolute record, which supposedly never happened before. But behind these emotional formulations lies a fairly simple reality. Movement through the key artery of the occupied peninsula is becoming less predictable. Amid strikes on infrastructure and fuel problems, any trip turns into a multi-hour wait and sometimes an attempt to simply get off the peninsula. As a result, the Kerch Bridge increasingly looks not like a reliable corridor, but like a bottleneck where queues, nerves, and the consequences of general logistical instability accumulate. And the peninsula itself in this picture is gradually shifting into a mode of constant transport pressure, where even leaving becomes an ordeal. Crimea, which Russian propaganda has for years presented as a fortress of security, increasingly looks like a region where logistics are tightening, pressure on the military system is growing, and everyday tension is building up. And while some try to patch holes and move resources, others continue to methodically undermine the very foundation of this calm, making the situation for the occupiers not just difficult, but systemically unstable.
The West has made its choice. While the Kremlin, for the fifth year in a row, waits for ally fatigue and dreams of weakening support for Kyiv, the opposite is happening. Volodymyr Zelensky's influence on world politics is rapidly growing. Leading Western publications are already openly writing about him as one of the most important political leaders of our time. And while Moscow tries to convince the world that time is on Russia's side, in the West they increasingly talk about Ukraine as a key player in Europe's future security system. Details follow in the report. This is no longer hidden even in the West. Zelensky is turning into a politician on whose decisions the future of all Europe increasingly depends. And while the Kremlin continues to dream of Ukraine's surrender, Zelensky's influence on global politics is becoming so significant that he is already being called one of the key political players of the modern world. Financial Times columnist Edward Luce has even concluded that today it is hard to find another politician who exerts such a serious influence on the future of European security. Moreover, the author allows for a rather ironic scenario. Zelensky could politically outlast both Putin and even Trump. This looks especially amusing against the backdrop of the Kremlin's long-standing predictions of the supposedly imminent fall of the Ukrainian government. In Moscow, they waited for years for the West to tire, Ukraine to crumble, and Zelensky to disappear from major politics. But while Russian propagandists continue to paint these fantasies in their TV broadcasts, reality is developing in the exact opposite direction. It is Kyiv that increasingly influences discussions about the future of NATO, the new security architecture of Europe, and even what the European Union will be like in the coming decades. The Financial Times also draws attention to another fact that is uncomfortable for many. While in leading Western countries governments change, political crises become almost a common occurrence, and voters increasingly support radical forces, Zelensky continues to demonstrate consistency in his goals. In fact, a paradoxical situation has arisen. A country that has been fighting a war for survival for 4 years now often sounds more confident about the future of Europe than many European capitals. The Kremlin is clearly not thrilled about this, because the war that was supposed to return Ukraine to the Russian sphere of influence has yielded the exact opposite result. Instead of an isolated state, Moscow got a Ukraine without which it is increasingly difficult to imagine the future system of European security. And Zelensky, from a politician who was predicted to have only a few weeks in power, has turned into one of the key participants in the discussion about the future of the entire West. And it seems this isn't the only piece of bad news for Putin. While Moscow tries to convince the world that time is on Russia's side, Washington is looking ever more closely at the Ukrainian army's results. According to the Financial Times, the latest Ukrainian strikes on Russian military targets impressed Trump so much that the Kremlin is now openly talking about a possible shift in the American position. And judging by the nervous reaction of Russian officials, they understand perfectly well how this might end. Lavrov's reaction was particularly telling. The head of the Russian Foreign Ministry essentially complained that Washington no longer acts as an objective mediator and is moving further away from the position Moscow was counting on. In other words, the Kremlin is starting to realize the unpleasant reality. The bet that the new American administration would force Kyiv to make concessions may ultimately fail. According to the Financial Times, during the G7 summit, Trump was extremely impressed by Ukraine's campaign of long-range strikes on Russian territory. Moreover, it was after these events that Washington began to question Russia's ability to achieve its strategic goals in the war. And this is already a serious blow to the main Kremlin narrative, which for years was built around the thesis of an allegedly inevitable Russian victory. No less alarming for Moscow is the fact that, in parallel, tougher sanctions against the Russian energy sector and new formats of military support for Ukraine are being discussed. Kyiv is already speaking with cautious optimism about the supply of missiles for Patriot and even the possible launch of their production in Europe and Ukraine. This means the Kremlin risks getting the exact scenario it feared most, a Ukraine that not only continues to fight but also gradually increases its capabilities with Western support. The greatest irony is that until very recently, Russian propaganda was talking almost daily about an imminent split between Kyiv and Washington. But today, the situation looks exactly the opposite. The more successfully Ukrainian forces act, the more often the West speaks of the need for further support for Ukraine. And the louder the Kremlin complains about the loss of an objective mediator, the more obvious it becomes that Moscow is starting to lose much more, the belief that it can pressure Ukraine on its own terms. And while the Kremlin reacts nervously to the change in mood in Washington, another telling signal appears. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte confirmed that active work is already underway on a potential peace agreement involving representatives of the Trump team, Rubio and Kushner. In other words, the talk of ending the war is gradually moving from the realm of declarations to the realm of concrete negotiation mechanisms. But there is one problem, and that problem is in the Kremlin. Rutte stated directly that advancing the peace process is only possible if Putin is ready to work on real agreements. However, for now, the Russian leader continues to insist on his maximalist demands. And here, a rather strange picture emerges. Moscow speaks louder and louder about negotiations, but at the same time continues to put forward conditions that make these negotiations practically impossible. One gets the impression that the Kremlin is simultaneously trying to escape the consequences of the war and pretend that it is still capable of dictating its own rules of the game. It gives the impression that the Kremlin is simultaneously trying to both, we spat on it, escape the consequences of the war and pretend that they are still able to dictate their own rules of the game. At the same time, Rutte's words were spoken against the backdrop of even more painful statistics for Moscow. According to the latest NATO estimates, Ukrainian forces are disabling between 30 to 35,000 Russian servicemen every single month, both killed and wounded. We are no longer talking about individual losses or failed operations, but about the systemic exhaustion of the entire Russian military machine. Moreover, according to the alliance's Secretary General, Ukraine's strikes are increasingly hitting not only the army but also the Russian economy as a whole, specifically through attacks on energy facilities and oil refining capacities. While Ukraine continues to expand its capabilities for strikes deep into the Russian rear, increases cooperation with its allies, and maintains the initiative in several key areas, the Kremlin is forced to spend more and more effort on protecting its own facilities, compensating for losses and patching up new holes. What was once presented as a quick campaign is increasingly resembling a prolonged war of attrition, the price of which for Russia is growing with every passing month. And if these current trends continue, then for Moscow, the main threat will not even lie in individual strikes or local failures on the front lines. The most dangerous factor could be the gradual accumulation of problems across all areas at once, in the military sphere, logistics, the economy, and in international politics. After all, history has proven more than once, major conflicts are often resolved not at the moment of the loudest battles, but rather when one of the sides is no longer able to maintain the level of tension that it created itself. And what do you think about these latest events? We look forward to your comments. There's more to come. Stay informed about the main things and don't forget to like. Wishing you peaceful skies above your head.